this book became interesting to me is that I, like many people, are increasingly concerned about the rejection of science or the dismissal of facts. And here we have one of our nation's founders, probably one of our most popular ones, embracing empirical truths, embracing observation and experimentation.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is 1762, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The governor, a man by the name of John Penn, rushes across town to the home of Benjamin Franklin. It's early in the morning, recorded as 2 a.m. The governor is frightened. He needs help. There's a mob closing on Philadelphia to kill Native Americans. This scene is one of many illustrating the many lives of Benjamin Franklin in a new book, Ingenious, a biography of Benjamin Franklin, scientist. Richard Munson is the author. I congratulate him and welcome him. Richard, at that moment, Franklin is a brave man. What does John Penn ask of him? Where does this mob come from called the Paxton Boys? Good day to you.
Good day to you. Thanks for the invitation. Paxton Boys were a gang, basically, in the Western settlements that were opposing the Indian tribes that had owned that or had been involved in that land for ages. They had slaughtered innocent Indians or Native Americans, and they were on their way to Philadelphia, where they hoped that they would slaughter even more. And John Penn, the governor of the Commonwealth, who had never been a good friend of Franklin's, they tended to fight each other, but he was desperate. He couldn't do much to stop the gang, he thought. But Franklin, who we mostly think of as a clever, humorous, fun sort of guy, as you note, he showed great bravery this day. He actually, with two other people, went to where they crossed the river on their way to Philadelphia and talked them down with just simply the power of his logic and his forcefulness of his, ethics. He was a brave man.
Very brave man, but we want to note here that this is not a young man. He was born in 1706. He's 56 years old, and in the 18th century, that is senior. Now, we know he will live into his 80s, as did one or two of his ancestors, but still, he didn't know that. And he's out in the middle of the night. I think he had 3 companions. He'd raised a company back in Philadelphia, but he was facing a mob that had already been homicidal, chopping up and massacring men, women, and children in Lancaster County some weeks before. So who is this man at 56, the governor?
He's far more complex of a character than I think his basic image of today is. When we think of Benjamin Franklin, we tend to think of this gentleman who gives us a little wink and a sly smile and tells, great little proverbs like early to bed, early to rise. We think of him as a diplomat who negotiated arms and money from the French to be able to win the Revolutionary War. What we really don't have much of an image of him is 2 things. One is the scientist, which I think we'll return to, but also he was just one brave man who was ethical and recognized that these Paxton Boys were homicidal and had to be stopped. And he, if you will, raised his hand, got on his horse with a couple of others and faced down a mob and turned them back.
This is the man also who is critical, signs all the documents for the revolution. But we go back to the beginning. His mother, Massachusetts Bay Colony, Abaya. But it is striking to me that Franklin was never a religious demonstration. He did not attend church, nor did his language reflect church going, though he was surrounded by Quakers in Philadelphia, and he comes out of the Massachusetts Bay Puritan colony. So I'd say, Richard, that he practiced a religion of, what should we call it? I know he was a Mason, but that isn't adequate to it. How did you come to think of his understanding? He was surrounded by extremely pious people. Was he in tension with them?
I think he was a restless young lad that wasn't really happy with his father doing extremely long blessings before and after the meals. He found them tedious and boring, similar to what he thought of Sunday sermons. It was far better in his mind to be reading books than it was to be listening to pontificators go off about how they should become better Presbyterians. So I think at the end, as he grew a bit older, he began to realize that he thought that salvation was not something that he was looking for. He thought he would be judged by his good works, and that's how he approached his life. And you're exactly right. His father was a very pious man, made his way up through the Puritan ranks to become something of a tithing man, if you will. But Franklin himself once referred to himself as a deist, was the closest term he could come to describing what his religious affiliation was. And that tied in very well to his science mindset, because the deism, at least at that time and how long it lasted, was a look at recognizing the wonders of nature and trying to understand, how God's creation, reflected, the need for doing good works and having a view of experimentation and observation of the world around him.
Yes, we'll see this. We'll see this tension often in some of the science. The big moment, though, comes when he's an apprentice to his older brother James as a printer, and he runs away. He runs away from his family. He runs away from Boston. He flees to Philadelphia. Why? What was he? Can we guess what he was thinking? Did he ever write a detail in his autobiography?
Well, he did break his contract with his brother, who ran a print shop, and Benjamin was an apprentice, supposedly working there, I think, for 8 years was his contract. But the two of them fought, and I think Benjamin, at his core, was just this independent young lad that didn't like anybody, giving him directions as to what he should be doing. And so the two fought because, his brother got taken away for a time from being the publisher. Ben, as a teenager, got to run it, enjoyed the independence, but his brother thought that he was getting far too independent, basically smacked him around. And young Ben didn't like that, and basically, without telling anybody, broke his contract and went off to Philadelphia, where he tried to begin a new life as a printer without an apprenticeship contract.
One detail about that apprenticeship: who was Silence Dogood?
Well, Benjamin's brother was one of the first independent journalists, and had sort of a very snarky tone to him, and surrounded himself with very creative writers. And he wouldn't accept anything from his young 15-year-old, brother, because he thought he was too much of a, young whippersnapper. But Benjamin would write little essays and slip them under his brother's door, and they became printed. It was not unusual at the time that people would write anonymous little ditties. And Franklin, as a 15-year-old teenager, wrote with the voice of a woman named Silence Dogood. Here he is, 15-year-old man, and he's writing about, with the voice of a widowed, 45, 50-year-old woman who has a cantankerous view towards anything that might impede upon her freedom and her view towards how the elite are not to be followed. So he just had even at a very early age, he had this snarky tone where he was able to make his points, but do it through other people's personas. In this case, this widowed woman who was, his voice piece to go after the elites of Boston.
The book is Ingenious, a biography of Benjamin Franklin's scientist. Richard Munson is the author. He arrives in Philadelphia at 17. In 22 years, he turns into an independently wealthy experimenter with a fine house on Market Street. It's an amazing transformation, including a tour in London as a young man who was living hand to mouth in printing shops. But printing, Richard, I came to understand that printing was the high tech of the age, and that Benjamin Franklin's invention in that printing shop in London was was front edge thinking. Do I read that correctly?
Very correctly. I mean, printing required a good deal of science. It required the mixing of various materials to make ink. You had to figure out with different types of paper what inks would be appropriate. He came up with also watermarks that would ensure that money could not be counterfeited. He came up with invisible ink. So yes, there was a lot of science that was involved in trying to make inks and paper, and he was incredibly successful at it.
He returns to Philadelphia after his apprentice in London, familiar with the London streets, especially the hard knocks part of the London streets. However, he quickly moves into being a printer again. He's taken advantage of by an older man. He does finally find the investors so he can send for equipment. And remember how fast he goes now. He has a vision. And Richard, you emphasized that a driving force was that Franklin wanted to be wealthy. The land speculation, the printing shop, the reselling when he sold his publishing business, his printing business, he sold it for an enormous amount of money. He was industrious, and even to the point of being, he was never greedy, but he had an eye on the bottom line. Is that fair?
I think it's very fair. And he also, appreciated how quality could in fact result in monetary returns. He was a very good printer, which in comparison to some of the other printers that he was competing with, gave him a great advantage. So he, actually redid some of the publications from the Pennsylvania legislature and did them in a much better quality and ingratiated himself with powerful people who then gave him more contracts to do more printing. So he also, when he was trying to start up a new newspaper, he basically created better voices and more entertaining articles than the competition. He was just darn good at what he did and recognized how to compete. And a little less well known was, as you mentioned in passing, but he also was a real estate investor that did quite well in both land development in Philadelphia as well as some of the seacoast areas up and down the colonies.
The politics was defensive at first. Maybe it always was defensive. This is a loyal son of the crown, a man who respects the law and doesn't bend the rules. However, there was a family called Penn, note, Pennsylvania. The progenitor died penniless, but his son, Thomas Penn, was a very careful lord who lived in absenteeism, and Franklin tangled with him. They all tangled with him. Why? What was Thomas Penn to Benjamin Franklin?
He was the opposite of providing independence to the people who lived in his colony. Mr. Penn had a lovely home in London, and his view of Pennsylvania was just simply a place to make money, to sell properties and to ensure that he had total control. So he appointed governors that basically ignored, the locally elected legislators, which included at some point Benjamin Franklin. And so Franklin, for a long time, tried to figure out how to get around Penn, actually was looking to have the king be responsible for overseeing the colony as he had been for many of the other colonies that became the United States. So he and Penn just fought back and forth for over the years, and I think the hatred grew with each passing year.
The politics are not separate from the science, and they're parallel, but the science makes the politics possible because it establishes that Benjamin Franklin is a polymath. That's the word we would use. A man who is always inventing. And that comes possible because he sells his businesses my date here is in 48, I believe. He sells his business 22 years later. He sells his businesses to one of his employees, and he's now independently wealthy. And he starts experimenting right away. He starts reading everything in the newspapers or from London. What was his thinking? He was idle. He was bored. Electricity immediately attracted him. You write that it was the fashion to use electricity for a parlor game. Why did Benjamin Franklin get involved in it?
I think he was always, even at a young age, he was just curious. I mean, the word ingenious was his favorite sort of word because it described what he thought was the mental and manual talents of his ancestors that he, revered. But it also was a word that described him. He just looked around the world, and at the time of the 18th century, this was the era of the Enlightenment, when the motto was, dare to know. And the new thing that was intriguing everyone was electricity. And yes, it was a form of entertainment because at that point we had no idea how to store it, how to use it to run machines or anything else. And so the parlor games were entertaining to him, but he knew that just instinctively, that there were opportunities that existed with this new form of energy. And so he not only will get to the kite experiment, but well before the kite experiment, he was doing sort of fundamental research on and defining all of the basic structures of electricity, coming up with names of positive and negative, of conductors and insulators, and a whole array of underpinnings of, the fundamental nature of electricity. He just found it to be entertaining and was on the cutting edge.
Remember now, Benjamin Franklin is not one thing. He's many things. And his fame as an experimenter with electricity and eventually with lots of practical advice about heating takes place between that time he became independent experimenter and bought a fine house with room to experiment in, and the time that his neighbors called on him to go represent their case in London as an agent of the Pennsylvania colony to win some relief from Thomas Penn taking advantage of them. Richard Munson's the author. Ingenious is the book. A biography of Benjamin Franklin, scientist. Yes, there's the patriot, there's the landowner, there's the successful businessman, there's the printer. He's in the assembly, but eventually he'll get tossed out of the assembly by his enemies. He has many of them who think that he takes credit for other people's work and that he's led a low life. There's lots of defamation. He struggled with that, but he was always busy in his lab. And what did he do in his lab? And what about that kite? Richard, it's a great pleasure to go through the steps up to the kite, especially because you make it clear in your reporting that recently it's been useful to media organizations and biographers to bring into question the kite experiment at all, because Franklin didn't record the date, the time. He didn't make a video of it. He didn't put it out on telegraph. You understand.
Yes.
He did it, but he didn't get there in one leap. He started with what is electricity? What remains a Leyden jar? What is that?
It's a rudimentary battery. It's something that is able to store electricity. Remarkable invention because you were able to move the battery to wherever you needed the power. So it was named after the city in which it was invented, but Franklin looked at it, thought it was a remarkable invention, and tried to improve it. And you're right. I mean, before the kite experiment, he was doing basic fundamental research on electricity. He came up with a thought that electrical charges, both positive and negative, were always seeking balance. It was a law that he referred to as the conservation of charge. And the great thing about this is that what scientists love about laws is that they tend to predict accurately various other scientific experiments. And that's what this one did. And other sort of modern day physicists would say the conservation law that Franklin developed would by itself have provided him as fame as a scientific pioneer.
He's an endless tinkerer is the way I can translate this. He makes He makes experiments in all directions, which of course doesn't make him the most venerated natural philosopher, except he is. And we're going to follow one particular course about electricity because he invents words that we use routinely now, such as condenser. Uh, Electricity was misunderstood entirely as a fire, although eventually Franklin calls it an electric matter. But there was a challenge to turn the fire into something practical. And that is our man, Benjamin Franklin. Before we get there, of course, his experimenting, including taking risks himself. I go to Christmas Day, 1750, and Benjamin Franklin having two Leyden jars. What happened, Richard?
He made the mistake of touching both the positive and the negative charges, and basically got himself thrown across the room and on the floor. Um, at the time, I mean, what I think this shows is that electricity is a dangerous, form of energy, and what he was doing had its dangers. And not only the kite experiment was even another one where somebody else, a Russian, tried to do the same experiment and ended up facing a lightning bolt that sent him to his grave, unfortunately.
Yes, Franklin wakes up after Christmas Day after blanking out with a lump on his head, and he goes, "Well, I guess that proves that it goes through you. It doesn't stop with you." Now, what is striking to me is the pamphlet issued in 1751, Experiments and Observations on Electricity, made in Philadelphia, America. That translates into it's printed in Europe and it gets to France and it makes him famous before the kite.
Yes. Yes.
So, although Richard notes that the book wasn't published in America till the 20th century, it's quite amazing. This was his fame. Need to get to the kite now because there was a practical use for it. Franklin was an observer who then came up with practical answers. And that's what the kite is. It's about the dangers of lightning and tall buildings, especially church steeples. Richard has some statistics. There were 360 lightning strikes in Germany on church towers in 1 year, and some incredible number of the sextons were damaged or killed by the lightning strikes because they had an idea that a church was protected in some fashion. There's even a village in northern Italy, Richard reports, that stored gunpowder in a church thinking it was safe, and it nearly wiped out the whole village when it exploded. So Franklin knows all this, and he wants to demonstrate that there might be a way of dealing with lightning. He actually thinks that maybe lightning is the same as the stuff out of the Leyden jars. They don't have proof of this now. And now we come to the kite, challenged by NPR, Richard reports. We don't know where it happened. We know it was someday in June, and it was with a toy kite. Why did he use a kite? What was he trying to achieve?
Well, he used a kite. He had originally thought that his experiment was to put a pole atop a tall building, and with the thought here that would collect electrostatic charges that he could then send down a wire into a battery and use that electricity elsewhere. His concern was that in Philadelphia at the time, there was no building that he felt was tall enough to be able to send a pole up into the clouds. And so his experiment was actually, he wrote it up, but he was not the first one to do it. It was actually at the request of the French king, a very, I guess, brave researcher. His name's Francois Dalibard, did the experiment at a church steeple about 25 miles north of Paris. And in fact, it was quite successful. He kept himself safe within a sentry box, if you will, something like a guard's booth. And being a Frenchman, he also made himself stand on an insulated pad that was placed atop about 5 or 6 different empty wine bottles. He was, as I note, in France, they had a lot of those. So the successful experiment was done not only by Francois Dalibard, but then it was repeated in Germany and in England and elsewhere. And Franklin didn't know about it because it took 6 weeks, sometimes 3 months to get word or ships to cross the Atlantic. And so while he was waiting, Franklin said, "Oh, let me try another way." And he put a basically a wire atop a kite, realizing that that could get up higher than any building in Philadelphia and thereby attract electrostatic charges and bring them down into this battery. Where the practical side comes up is that he did therefore make the connection and proved the connection between electricity and lightning. But he realized that there was a way of using this pole or this wire to be able to protect the populace, both people and buildings, from electrostatic charges such as lightning. And so he put on his own house and put on the Philadelphia legislature and a variety of other places. This became probably one of the great practical discoveries that saved, as you noted, both lives and buildings.
Yes, the lightning rod. And he gives instructions. And one of the recommendations made to him through the ages is his instructions are very easily understood. He had a knack for speaking in commonsensical language. A moment. Everybody knows about the Franklin stove, especially if you live in New England. This is named for Benjamin Franklin, although others improved on it. Cast iron stove that's going to throw heat and not make smoke. What's wonderful, Richard, is that he keeps experimenting with it. He doesn't just do something and take a patent out and collect money. In fact, I think he denied that he wanted a patent for the stove. Is that correct?
That is correct. And the governor of Pennsylvania offered him a patent whereby he would have made a whole lot of money.
Yeah.
And you had noted that he had been successful in business ahead of time. So it wasn't like he needed money, but he probably would have enjoyed getting more. But he viewed the stove as something that would provide great benefit to his compatriots. And that is a warm, a more efficient stove that brought both warmth and got rid of some of the smoke that was typical of the stoves at that era.
And it continued to change the details of the stove and where the plates should be and how to keep the draft from coming in when the fire's not lit.
This is, I think, an example of Franklin just continued to experiment. I mean, he would come up with a new idea and, give it a try, thinking that there would be improvement. And I think this is one of his wonderful, attributes but he did things with both the stove and the electricity, but he did it with sort of a joyfulness that I found really absolutely wonderful. You read his laboratory notes and they're filled with admirations of the results turned out to be far more fascinating than we had thought. It was a wonder to see the work that was done. Even when the experiment didn't work out the way that he thought it was, Franklin, joyful that he was thinking, we opened up new possibilities that might lead us into more other interesting projects. So I think one of the things that surprised me, I had always sort of known that he was a clever man or that had this sort of trickster sense of joy about him, but the amount of just, pleasure that he got out of experimenting and discovering was remarkable and infectious.
I have a partial list: refrigeration, meteorology, kidney stones, the American Philosophical Society in 43, the Academy and College of Pennsylvania in 51. That becomes UPenn. Experimenting on nature, observing nature, the oil over water, goes on and on and on. We're going to remember, the politics are here. The experimentation is here. Experimentation opens doors. So we're going to open some of those doors, and one particular door, cockpit. When the king loses a genius. This book is Ingenious, a biography of Benjamin Franklin. Richard Munson is the author. Emphasis in Richard's book on the experimental Franklin, but there was the political Franklin we know well from revolutionary times. He was older than our founders. He was a founder. All of the names we know so well look up to Franklin as this antique wandering around and a somewhat stout man in his seniority. 70 would have been old in the 18th century. 80 would have been unbelievable, something comparable to 150 today. And we'll get there. But I go to one particular moment when it was clear to me that Franklin wanted to find a way to keep the colonies in train with the empire, the king. He didn't want to be defiant. And the parliament put him in a place called the cockpit, which is really the hearing hall in Whitehall. And the prosecutor for the parliament lambasted him. That's an inadequate word, without Franklin being able to answer for himself, and defamed him in front of Parliament or those who attended. I've always felt, Richard, and you came across this moment in your book, that was when they lost him. And if that scene hadn't happened, or if there'd been the opposite of, can we find a way to work together, Franklin would have stayed loyal, and maybe he would have influenced the Continental Congresses. What do you make of it?
I think you're exactly right. The English, particularly the Parliament, lost their best possible advocate, their best mediator, who still loved the king and was hopeful that the king would have the colonies be part of a grand British empire. The reason that he got in the cockpit is that he released some letters from the English appointed governor of Massachusetts. And the Parliament just felt that this was their chance to get back at him, get back at the colonies for the Boston Tea Party, which I should note just in passing. I mean, Franklin was abhorred by the Tea Party, thinking that it was an abuse of private property, and disliked mobs and was far more interested in reasoned argument. But the Parliament were so angry at the colonies, and this was their chance to get back at Franklin, who was in England as representative of the various colonies. And they just grilled for over an hour and lambasted him. And as you know, he sat there and sort of took it, but he was sort of realizing that a chapter had turned here. He could no longer think that there was a way to alleviate the tension between the colonies and the Parliament. And it was probably the time that he then, when he went back, began to think far more appropriately about independence. If I might, though, go back to what you had mentioned in the last segment, the American Philosophical Society. This was also a chance for Franklin on the opposite side of, instead of being yelled at, here he was when he was back in the United States or the United Colonies. He created, or he believed that American would be recognized and appreciated by European elites if they were able to demonstrate technological and intellectual prowess. And so he created an association, the American Philosophical Society, that was an intercolonial group of researchers. And to be honest, it was probably one of the first efforts to bring together representatives from all of the colonies, which at that point were unbelievably strictly independent entities that didn't like the thought of having to work together with the national government. And so in some ways, Franklin, through this association of researchers, this united association of researchers, set the foundation for the United States.
The cockpit is January of 74. He returns to Philadelphia in April of 75. The guns are already out. He meets with Howe before the Battle of Long Island in September 76, and he can't find a way even to calm Howe down. October 76, he sails to Paris. He's solar system famous at this point. The French adore him. They call themselves the Franklinistes. Wonderful. There's so much more to Franklin, but we've talked about his experiments. Richard, though, adds a chapter that's refreshing. how Franklin's been used by the epochs and the biographers ever since. It's a revelation to me, Richard. The one I liked, I've told you already, Mark Twain. Those lists he made about good conduct ruined the lives of other boys who otherwise would have been happy. But there are uses of Franklin that are appropriate for the time, and they can't see it. And maybe we're in one right now. You can't know what the future is going to think about us. I've mentioned, though, the challenge to the kite experiment. Odd, very odd. Why is that happening? It's a demythologizing that seems uncalled for.
I wish I had a good answer for that one because I do think it is uncalled for. Franklin has gone through numerous stages, which is not unusual for historians to reflect upon past events largely through the lens of their current situation, and that has changed over the years. So Franklin went from being idolized as, the leader of independence or the creator of a new form of, philosophy called pragmatism, or he was viewed because he came up with these lists to be more industrious or to focus more on order, of being kind of a puffy, person that was a little bit boring of telling people what to do. And so we've gone back and forth on him. And I think at the moment we're in an interesting time, at least from my perspective. Why this book became interesting to me is that I, like many people, are increasingly concerned about the rejection of science or the dismissal of facts. And here we have one of our nation's founders, probably one of our most popular ones, embracing empirical truths, embracing observation and experimentation.
Ingenious is the book. Richard Munson's the author. Highly recommend visiting Franklin in this moment. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.